Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you. Perhaps I start by saying a couple of very general things about the situation up until now. Up until this latest crisis, I think that the most interesting thing for those of us who look at the Middle East as a whole is the fact that Israel had essentially disappeared from the equation of people's concerns in the region. And I'll start by making this observation. Throughout my now middle-aged life, it's always been said to me by people of every political party, every political persuasion, every generation pretty much of British politicians and politicians from Europe, America and elsewhere have been saying the same thing. And I heard it throughout, which was that essentially all of the problems of the Middle East, and indeed perhaps the world globally, could be solved if a solution was found to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. I heard it from the Blair government, I heard it from members of the previous Conservative government, I heard it from the current Conservative government. It didn't matter whether it was William Hague, David Miliband, it was always the same line, that effectively what we were waiting, and of course this got a great boost after 9/11 when everyone became an expert in the Middle East. Effectively that this was what we were waiting for, that if only a solution could be found to this border dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians, everything would be solved. It was, in that famously hackneyed and inappropriate phrase, the key to unlocking the problems of the Middle East. And of course from 2011, when parts of the Arab Street across North Africa and across the Middle East started to rise up against their rulers and against the dictators, it became clearer than I think it had been for a long time just how nonsensical that key claim was, because nobody among all the people who came out into Tahrir Square in Egypt, none of the people who came out and protested in Tunisia or in Syria or anywhere else in the region, in Yemen, none of them had any banners saying, "We are protesting because we don't think there should be any building in East Jerusalem by Israelis." None of them. They were all protesting for, at the beginning, very similar things, which was basic rights, which were enjoyed by most other people in the world, particularly in the Western world. They wanted more say in their future, and they wanted something less, something more rather, than the completely inequitable distribution of wealth that has plagued that region, and which any of you who go to any country than Israel in the region will notice means that all of the young of the country, all of the potential of the country, waste their lives on street corners with no prospects for the future, because the tiny amount of wealth is held by a tiny amount of, or the large amount of wealth is held by a tiny amount of people, and it never trickles down. So from 2011 onwards, the Middle East seemed to have changed. It seemed to have borne out what many of us pointed out for many years, which was that the Israeli-Palestinian dispute was actually completely separate from the wider regional problems, and that it didn't matter whether you got a solution or not to that problem. It would not solve the problems of living standards in Syria. It would not solve educational standards or democratic norms in Egypt, in Tunisia, or anywhere else. Now, as I say, for the last few years, the Middle East and the world's attention, I would argue, has largely been off Israel. I think that a lot of people saw through the lie, not just in this country, but across the Middle East. People saw, started to notice, started to point out that they weren't going to be put off any longer by rulers who, and sometimes it is literally as coarse as this, a rumor will go round about the new private jet owned and bought on state money by a particular despot, and the moment they want to deflect attention from it, they'll say, "Look what the Israelis are doing for Palestinians." It's a deflect. That it started to become clear that people on the so-called Arab Street didn't believe that either, and they were right not to believe it. One of the quiet successes of those few years was, among other things, that foreign newspapers and foreign television companies drew down their bureaus in Israel. Up until and during and a bit after the Second Intifada, whole careers were made by BBC and other journalists being in Jerusalem, reporting as if they were in a war zone, and they had the comfort of reporting in a war zone, but actually sitting in the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem drinking cocktails. But the bureaus slowly started to, and very quietly started to diminish their reporters there. For several reasons, but one very obviously, which was that if you were a young reporter in those years, the game was simply not in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. The story of our time, the story of the region, what was going on, was next door. It was in Egypt. It was in Syria. It still is in Syria. It was in Iraq. It still is in Iraq. But it was not about Israel. And I say that as a preface because, of course, one of the things that's happened in recent weeks is that strange feeling, that hope one always has that the world will finally get things in proportion, will finally understand the various conflicts in the world in proportion, will be addressed. People will realize this, and they will react and emote accordingly. And unfortunately, the last month has reminded even the most stalwart of optimists that it comes back to Israel doing anything, and the world has a very different reaction. I did a rather unpleasant sum for a piece, I think about a year ago, where I pointed out that if you added up all of the wars in which Israel has had to be involved in since and including the War of Independence, if you added up all of the Israelis killed and you added up all of the highest estimates from the Arab countries of the number of people that they lost in those wars, in all of these, including 67, 73, if you include every Palestinian, if you include all of the people from all sides in every single war in which Israel has been involved since the War of Independence, you get up to about 6 months average killing for Bashar al-Assad. So what is the explanation for this? How can it possibly be the case that the world ignores all these conflicts, that journalists seem not to bother with a lot of these conflicts? So why is it that Israel once again gets involved in a conflict with Hamas, and we see this unprecedented interest, this unprecedented ire and rage expressed against Israel? Well, before getting on to a couple of the possible explanations for this, let me just say a few words about the conflict which Israel is involved in. I'm not a supporter of everything any Israeli government does, any more than I'm a critic of anything that any Israeli government does. I think that's the same for any independent person. But there is a problem in this conflict which, it strikes me, needs to be addressed at some point and which needs to be faced up to. At the moment, roughly every 18 months to 2 years, Israel is having to go into Gaza in some form and to reduce the ability of Hamas, Islamic Jihad and other terror groups to fire rockets into Israel. It seems to me, and I welcome thoughts about this in a minute, it seems to me that this is a very worthwhile thing to do. It's a very important thing to do. It is vital for the people of Israel, the 80% of Israelis who at some point are under rocket fire from Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other such groups. It is vital that there is success in stopping, or at least slowing down, the ability of these groups to fire rockets into Israel. However, that as an objective is a very short-term one, and this is something that concerns me and I think should concern everyone else. If we are fated to have this happen every 2 years, I think there will be significant problems for Israel in the years ahead. My own view, for what it's worth, is that it is a mistake for the Israeli government to say that the objective is anything other than the destruction of Hamas. As long as Hamas is in charge of the Gaza, as long as it is in government, and as long as it fails to achieve what so many Panglossian people hoped it would achieve and arrive in government and suddenly become Jeffersonian Democrats, in the meantime, the only worthwhile operation of Israel going into Gaza and coping with this much necessary international opprobrium is to try to, at some point, win. And that is, I think, to some extent, a very unpopular thing to say these days. I'll just mention something about why I think that is. There is a great mistake, I think, that has crept into our thinking in the West. And that is the mistake of thinking, and it's largely based on the paradigm of Northern Ireland, which I can get onto and bore you about for hours if you would like, I promise. I can clear a room in seconds. But it's mainly to do with the Northern Ireland paradigm in this country. And it is the idea that conflicts end by the two sides getting down, sitting around a table, and talking out their differences. This, I would submit, in the history of warfare, is not how most wars end. Most wars end by one side winning and the other side losing. And the side that's won knows that it's won, and the side that lost knows that it's lost. It's very rare in the history of conflict that you just have a stalemate, you have a gentleman's agreement, and everyone goes away and abides by it. As I say, Britain's ability to try to transplant the Northern Ireland experience, which, as I say, without going into it, I don't think has been quite what some people think it has. After all, if Israel were to do what happened in Northern Ireland, the best case scenario would be that it would have to ask the bloodiest Hamas commanders. It would have to get Ismail Haniyeh and bring him into the Israeli cabinet. So the paradigm doesn't work, and the way to come to peace like that doesn't work. But I do think that Israel and friends of Israel should think seriously about what long-term winning and securing long-term the safety of the Israeli people means. Because I would submit that if this happens every 18 months to 2 years, it could go on forever. I'm a perfect pessimist about that. It is possible it could go on forever like that. But I think that it would be unwise and possibly at some point unsustainable for Israel to keep fighting wars solely on those grounds of as has been claimed to be used, the phrase is mowing the grass. The problem, and I'll come back to this, is something which I think can't be said enough, it certainly can't be said in the media enough. The problem is Hamas. That is the root cause of this particular part of the conflict. It's the conflict within other conflicts, but it is the problem. The hopes of some Panglossian figures in the international community in 2006 and 2007 that somehow Hamas had always said they wanted to annihilate the Jewish state, but they may moderate in the coming years. That's unfortunate. They killed their fellow Palestinians from Fatah and threw them off tops of buildings and shot them in the back when they were running away, but maybe at some point they'll realize that was a mistake and they'll be nicer. Maybe they will have another election. No, we're still waiting on that one. All these years later, still waiting for that moment when Hamas allows another election in the Gaza. Hamas is the problem in this conflict. And it seems to me that every discussion about this matter that doesn't start from that premise, or that starts from the premise that there are two sides in the equation and equally valid at that, or equally to be listened to, is a great mistake. However, I do want to make some optimistic remarks about this. Among others, to say what I think can be done. Too few people who write and think and talk about the region, I think, focus on what can be done meaningfully. I speak to MPs most days of the week, and one of the things you can hear from MPs of all parties is that they are feeling huge pressure when it comes to the subject of Israel and Israeli actions in the Gaza, and they are feeling that pressure from their constituents. I spoke to an MP recently who has a very large Jewish population in his constituency, who said that even there, the number of letters he gets from people supporting Hamas or the Palestinians in general vastly outnumbers the number of letters he gets from anyone who is pro-Israel. I just mention it. It's not the solution in itself. But I have noticed, and I've noticed it in the course of my own career such as it is to date, that things like that are, things like letter writing, things like being in touch with your MP are regarded by friends of Israel as, among other things, kind of schleppy. Why am I going to become one of those people? I don't want to become one of those mad letter writers who, with respect to the two people at the back, I don't become one of those sort of crazy old people who fires off letters to strangers confessing either love or hate, sometimes both. Well, this is a good example of where that attitude has to be dropped. The reason why MPs say that they are feeling like they're getting pressure is because they are getting post bags full of pressure. What's more, those people who are good, who speak up, the supporter MPs and so on, very rarely get any thanks for it. Very rarely. That doesn't mean they're not going to do it. There are terrific MPs, like MP for Harlow, Rob Halfon, who will say what they say in support of Israel, however many letters they get. But the point is that there is something missing in the equation, and among other things, it is an organised and consistent and coherent voice on behalf of decent people in this country. Now, it's always been my belief in these conflicts that the division of attitude in Britain pretty much falls along the following lines. Around 10 to 15% of the British public know what their attitudes towards Israel are and are very supportive. They're not all Jewish, some of them are, some of them aren't. Around another 10 to 15% of the British public are very supportive of the Palestinian cause in general and extremely hostile to Israel in particular. Now, a lot of people spend a lot of time rightly focusing on the attitudes of that latter 10 to 15% of the general public. And they are important, they are disturbing. When a Lib Dem MP like David Ward comes out with his comments, when somebody like Baroness Boom Tong comes out with her comments, when somebody like George Galloway does his. These sort of people, yes, it's very unpleasant, and yes, it should have a reaction. However, what about that remaining, and go with me on the sums, 70 to 80% of the British public who really don't have a fixed opinion on these matters? What do we have to say to them? And what possible thing can be imparted to them during a conflict like this, when it is on their TV screens every night, and it is on the front page of their newspapers every day? Now, for these periods, that 80 or 70% of the public is in very considerable flux, it would seem to me. They open their papers and they see terrible pictures of babies and families in Gaza who've been hit by shells. Now, those people don't want that. They don't understand the conflict. They don't always want to hear very much about the conflict, but they know that's bad. They know that the death of anyone is bad, and they're right. But what do we do, those of us who recognize Israel's case and want to support and explain Israel's case? What do we do in these situations for that group of people? Well, I will mention a couple of ideas, but one in particular strikes me. And in approaching this, I'll mention a little bit about some things happening in Europe at the moment. It seems to me that the most important, or one of the most important arguments that needs to be explained, and it's not a big piece of, as it were, PR spin, but a fact that needs to be explained at the moment, is that Hamas is not like other governments. Hamas is not like other people. Hamas is ISIS, it is Al-Qaeda, it is Hezbollah, it is Boko Haram, it is Al-Shabaab. That's what it is. That is the company it keeps. There are differences in their some of their interpretations. There are some strategic and tactical differences, and there are geographic differences between these groups. But essentially, if you boil down the ideology of the people who decided to steal 300 schoolgirls in northern Nigeria the other month, if you boil down the ideology of the group that has gone across Syria and Iraq, crucifying people and beheading people, wiping out ancient Christian communities, taking over a whole section of northern Iraq, including cities, including having unbelievably an air force at its disposal once it gets the ability to fly in the helicopters and others it's got, the people who have now got control of major oil refineries in northern Iraq. These people are all the same as Hamas. They all have at root the same fundamentalist doctrine, the same radical interpretation of Islam, the same bloodthirstiness, the same intent. They have it against different groups of people wherever they find them. The world has to realize this is all part of the same movement. As I say, there are tactical, geographical differences, but what unites them is the same ideology. And the reason I say that that's important is because of a second point, and this comes back to what is happening in Europe at the moment. It seems to me that for the majority of people, that's 70 to 80%. Many of them don't have any attitude, as I say, towards Jews in general, or the Jewish state. They've picked up bits of history, usually bad bits of history, or inaccurate bits of history, as we all do. One of the things which, it seems to me, these people have to realize now, is to understand the phrase, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. And this message is not just something which you can hear and see being practiced across parts of the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere in the world. It's also the thing you can see on our own streets. In all of the protests against Israel in Europe in recent weeks, yes, there have been Palestinian flags. Yes, there have been Hamas flags. Yes, there have been Hezbollah flags. All of these things we've almost got used to, sadly, in our cities. However, this time round there has been an added, I would argue, venom and an added evil in this demonstration and this display of hatred toward Israel for asserting her right to self-defense. Because behind the flags of the Hamas, behind the flags of the Hezbollah and the Palestinian flags have been the black flag. The black flag of jihad. This was flown in London 2 weeks ago at a demonstration of young Muslims from East London who blocked the tunnel coming into the city, and one of the cars was flying the black flag of jihad in London. In The Hague, the pro-Palestinian demonstration included, as part of it, people flying the black flag. That was just after, in The Hague, there had been a pro-ISIS demonstration. In Germany, Germans wake up and find that an imam in Berlin has said that the Jews in their totality should be annihilated. The Germans wake up and discover that at an anti-Israel protest they're chanting death to the Jews. I have some faith. I wouldn't keep speaking or thinking or doing anything if I didn't. I have some faith that in time, and presenting this clearly enough and often enough to people, people can see what is in front of their eyes, and that they can be helped to connect these things up. It seems to me that the anti-Israel movement globally is extremely close to things that the world has seen before, and it should be unadulteratedly and unalloyedly presented in that light. When people say, and there are a lot of people who say that they are friends of Israel, and then go on to say but, and then they say I disagree, I agree to its right to self-defense, but blah 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 blah. But they can never find a time when they actually do agree with Israel's right to self-defense. Those people should be criticized for that. When it's people who claim to be friends of the Palestinian people and actually end up being apologists for Hamas, those people should be criticized for that. But as I say, at the root of this whole thing has to be an understanding, and I'm not sure, I sense it's starting to come out, but has to be an understanding of the reality and the ideology of this particular enemy. Because there are people in Europe, and maybe I'll pass over to you on this thought, there are people in Europe in particular who are very tempted, but they're probably the same people who were led astray by that idea that the key for the Middle East argument, but people who have very simple arguments, these things, and simple explanations, who may well think in time that indeed our security is damaged by Israel. This was what, by the way, Baroness Wazi said in her resignation letter today, that if the British government didn't come out more to condemn Israel, it would be felt on our streets. Now, I think there's one straightforward thing to that. You don't say, if a group of people of any religion, any background, any class, faith, or anything else, say, we can't promise we're not going to be violent if you don't do what we want. There is only one response to that, which is you say, fine, you try to be violent and we're going to have the police and they've got truncheons. You hold the rule of law. And you do not give in to the mob. You do not give in to blackmail. You do not give in to threats of violence and thuggery and intimidation. But that threat, which hangs over Europe, is, I would submit, something a lot of our politicians feel. I've spoken to MPs who've said this in recent weeks and before. I don't know if there aren't going to be riots on the streets if this happens, if that happens. I would submit that among other things, you have to explain to people, we have to explain to people, this is not something you can sell. Israel is not a thing which, if you just sell it down the river a bit, you buy your own security. You know, I mean, it's an overused phrase, but the famous phrase of Churchill's about appeasers was that an appeaser is somebody who feeds a crocodile in the hope it'll eat him last. You have to explain to European people, even if Israel was wiped out tomorrow by the people on all of its borders who wish to wipe it out, even if this happened, you would not be securing your long-term security, because the people who are flying the flags of Hamas today will be flying the flags of Al-Qaeda and Jihad tomorrow. This is the same ideology. It is inextricably linked, and it needs to be countered, and it needs to be countered by decent people everywhere, including Muslims, including Jews, including people of no faith at all. It needs to be a concerted global effort to say it is not a partisan point, but a simple point of civilization. That if you believe in civilization, if you believe in civilized values, including liberal values, then you stand with Israel and you stand with the Jewish state. People can be taught to hate, but they can also be taught not to hate. And just as David can be turned into Goliath on the international scene, maybe we can turn it back. Maybe we can make clear to people this is the other way around. They've got it the wrong way around. And I say I have some hope in that because I know because my opponents, your opponents, our opponents, civilization's opponents, are able to turn this very effectively on a day-to-day basis. It's because Hamas has operations in London, some of which operate not only legally but with charitable status. It's because Hamas has operations in London that you can get lots of the filth that's pumped around as being what's happening in Israel in this city. Well, they're doing that, and they're doing that because they want Israel to die. Those of us who want Israel to live and to flourish and to be able to enjoy life like any other nation, and maybe a bit more, we'll have to make the other argument, and we'll have to organise, and we'll have to do some of the things we don't want to do, like schlepping to our MP every now and then, or writing to them, making our voice heard, whether it's on social media, or on Twitter or Facebook, and fighting that. It's happened before against us, and this time we can try to turn it around for. But it really is in your hands. I mean, I can't stress that enough. No one will do it for you if you don't do it for yourselves. If people aren't to feel some pressure from you, then they won't feel it from anyone. And I would just say, you've been kind enough to listen to me tonight, and you've been kind enough to come here awaiting the breaking of a fast, or for whatever reason. But you've come here tonight for that, and I think that itself is a demonstration you want to do something. We all want to do something, but we've got to get going on it. Thank you. We're waiting for that if only a solution could be found to this border dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians, everything would be solved. It was, in that famously hackneyed and inappropriate phrase, the key to unlocking the problems of the Middle East. And of course, in 2011, when parts of the Arab Street across North Africa and across the Middle East started to rise up against their rulers and against the dictators, it became clearer than I think it had been for a long time just how the fact that Israel had essentially disappeared from the equation of people's concerns in the region. And I'll start by making this observation. Throughout my now middle-aged life, it's always been said to me by people of every political party, every political persuasion, every generation pretty much of British politicians and politicians from Europe, America and elsewhere have been saying the same thing. And I heard it throughout, which was that essentially all of the problems of the Middle East, and indeed perhaps the world globally, could be solved if a solution was found to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. I heard it from the Blair government, I heard it from members of the previous Conservative government, I heard it from the current Conservative government. It didn't matter whether it was William Hague, David Miliband, it was always the same line, that effectively what we were waiting. And of course this got a great boost after 9/11, when everyone became an expert in the Middle East. Effectively, that this was what nonsensical that key claim was, because nobody among all the people who came out into Tahrir Square in Egypt, none of the people who came out and protested in Tunisia or in Syria or anywhere else in the region, in Yemen, none of them had any banners saying, "We are protesting because we don't think there should be any building in East Jerusalem by Israelis." None of them. They were all protesting for, at the beginning, very similar things, which was basic rights, which were enjoyed by most other people in the world, particularly in the Western world. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you. Perhaps I start by saying a couple of very general things about the situation up until now. Up until this latest crisis, I think that the most interesting thing for those of us who look at the Middle East as a whole is the